Thank you very much, Mr. Harmon. Mr. Rolla?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the second time that I've had the privilege of appearing before the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The first time was over a dozen years ago when the subcommittee was dealing with the problem of how to best attack labor racketeering and organized crime's influence in the labor movement. I quite frankly find it incredible that a dozen years later that I am back before, in part, the same subcommittee, and I'm hearing the same thing that I heard before 1978 from Dick Thornburgh. When he sat here and he testified as Attorney General, he said the same thing he was saying 15 years ago as a United States Attorney in Pittsburgh. Merge the strike forces into the U.S. Attorney's Office. Mr. Thornburgh talked about new situations and new ways of dealing with problems because the crime problem has changed. But yet he presented to you this morning the same solution he had 15 years ago. The difference, however, is in presenting that position now is that he is ignoring the irrefutable fact of the overwhelming success of the strike force program. I don't quite understand how Judge Bonner can say that the strike force program was not successful in Los Angeles when two successful LCN hierarchies have been prosecuted. Perhaps the law enforcement community in Los Angeles have difficulty recognizing progress and success, as apparently they do with how many chief law enforcement officers there are in the district. There's only one. There is only, always, ever been only one, the United States Attorney. Another example, and I'll be very brief, of the successes of the strike force that I think is particularly germane to this committee is the success that was had in Cleveland, where I had the opportunity to be the attorney in charge of the commencement of the investigation that ultimately led to the conviction of James T. Licavoli, who was the boss of the family and virtually destroyed that family. There is no question what the result was. Angelo Leonardo, the former underboss, testified before this very subcommittee a year ago that the mob in Cleveland is destroyed. The same type of approach, the same type of success was achieved in Buffalo, New York. You have heard Mr. Vira talk about and others talk about the successes in Philadelphia, where once again, we're in the second generation of prosecution of the entire hierarchy of the LCN. If allowed to go forward, the LCN in Philadelphia will disappear because they're going to run out of people to replace the people who are being put in jail, and they're going to run out of money because we're putting the sources of revenue out of business. In that whole Great Lakes region, as Mr. O'Sullivan referred to, there is one place where organized crime has not had the problems that it had in Cleveland, Buffalo, and Philadelphia, and that's in Pittsburgh. And anyone who will sit here and tell the committee that there is any other reason for that other than the fact that Dick Thornburgh, in one of the first acts he did as an assistant attorney general, was to close down that strike force. If the U.S. attorney has the time and the resources and the knowledge to fight organized crime, then why wasn't it done in Pittsburgh, where the biggest threat to the LCN there is gestational attrition? That's what this committee has to view. When I was attorney in charge in Cleveland, and I supervised Operation Pendorf, and we went one up on Mr. Hogue here, because that electronic surveillance went for 13 months. The case started with one U.S. attorney of one political party. It culminated in the prosecution of Roy Williams, the conviction of Roy Williams, under the term of another U.S. attorney from a different political party. Even more pronounced is the span of U.S. attorneys in Milwaukee, which is an example of another city where the LCN was virtually wiped out. 4 different U.S. attorneys, and not just the U.S. attorneys, 4 different sets of staff came and went from the start of the Balistreri case until the end of it. Don't tell me, and don't tell the FBI in Milwaukee, that Frank Balistreri would have been convicted in the Hobbs Act case in Milwaukee if it had been handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, because they're going to tell you you're crazy. Now, that doesn't mean that the U.S. attorneys are incompetent. I doubt if Mr. Thornburg is going to sit here and say that the reason nothing happened in Pittsburgh since 1976 is that he was the last competent U.S. attorney ever to sit in that district. The problem is not the competency, although there have been occasions of that, but that's not the real problem. It's the commitment of dedicated resources to the problem. Mr. Thornburg confuses the coordination needed to handle organized crime with a coordination within a district. Coordination within a district of a U.S. Attorney's Office isn't the problem. It's the national coordination. And you have heard witness after witness after witness tell you that the U.S. attorneys can't do it and they haven't done it. So why are we going to turn it back to them now? The reason I suggest to you is the only real turf battle that still exists. And that's the one Mr. Vira alluded to. There's no way a strike force chief can open up a case in a district if the U.S. attorney doesn't want it opened up. There is no way he can do anything without the U.S. attorney's approval. The turf battle is the U.S. attorneys want back, wait, I strike that. Some of the U.S. attorneys want back that which they feel was taken from them by the Department of Justice 20 years ago. And they want those resources. Why do they want have those resources? To do with them exactly as they want and exactly as they will be able to do. Mr. Chairman, the stakes here are too high. They're too high to go back to the failed programs of the past. And make no mistake about it, that's what Mr. Thornburg wants to do. The American people cannot suffer such a folly. I guess Mr. Thornburg, in one last comment I have, said he had not heard of anyone recommend that the strike force concept be utilized to fight drug trafficking. Well, he can't say that anymore because that's exactly what I recommend. If we're serious about dealing with a domestic drug problem of the criminal cartels, then the strike force concept ought to be applied to that program rather than ending the most successful national crime program the Department of Justice has ever had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rolla. I was going to ask this question later, but I'll address it to you or any other member of the panel now. But on that point, which I think is a key point, would you have the existing strike forces, if you had your way, handle the drug organized crime cartel problem, or would you set up a separate strike force?
I think with the testimony you have heard here today about the correlation between organized crime and between narcotics cartels, that the institutional experience would be wasted if you totally separated the two programs. Right now, the strike forces, in terms of personnel and power, are not set up to do that. The legislation that was introduced or suggested a year ago, which I believe created a separate division called the Organized Crime and Narcotics Division of the Department of Justice, would be the way to deal with that. Whether the actual offices are separate or not, I don't think is really relevant.
Thank you, Mr. Rolla. Mr. Slappy?